Yeah, thanks so much for coming out. We had one event earlier in January, so this is our second official Sovereign House event, and it's wonderful to see you guys here. I want to make sure to give a warm welcome to our two panelists. I guess I should say opponents. Not in real life. They like each other. I don't know. Okay. And yeah, so let me just start off by introducing Charles Lehman. He is with the Manhattan Institute. He's a fellow. Does a lot of work on making sure none of you ever get to smoke weed again. And he'll be explaining why, so it's exciting. And then we have Jacob Rich. He is a policy analyst with Reason Foundation, is very into you guys getting to smoke weed. So if you like weed, you like this guy. He also is a PhD student at Case Western. So yeah, he's going to be Dr. Jake Rich at some point.
We'll see.
We'll
see.
No, that's true. It's going to be embarrassing if he doesn't. So, but we won't talk about that. So I guess we should just start off with a general question, and I think it doesn't really matter who starts. Just one of you, whoever's most anxious, can jump in. But our first question, I think, should be: is the current status quo of weed legalization reasonable? Does it matter? Who do you care?
Oh, I was going to say you.
No, you should go.
Okay. All right, go ahead.
Is the current status quo reasonable? I'd say absolutely not. We have lots of problematic use. Problematic use has been going up. And it's clearly because marijuana is still illegal throughout the entire United States. And the reason that is because federal law always trumps state law. So even though state-level governments are tolerating regulated industries, various components of how these industries work are not efficient. And because of that, various issues of violence, problematic use, product standards, none of that can actually be enforced. And for that to improve, we actually need the federal government to recognize that marijuana is legal throughout the entire United States, so that various mental health outcomes, traffic industries, and various things that inevitably could get worse under an illegal or illegal regime can actually be corrected. But that can't be done until we actually move out of this gray legalization area and move towards full legalization.
Perhaps surprisingly, I would agree that the status quo is no good, but really in the other direction. What we have today is a patchwork. Oh, am I not on?
I don't think you're on.
Oh, now I'm on. Am I good?
Yeah, you're good.
Good. What we have today is a patchwork of legalization. In some jurisdictions, marijuana is legal. In other jurisdictions, it's legal if you happen to have the right documentation. In other jurisdictions, it's not legal at all. It's federally illegal, but in states where marijuana is legal, federally appropriated dollars cannot be spent on enforcement, and enforcement action is otherwise limited by the Department of Justice, so really the feds can't do that much. What we end up with is, I wouldn't say the worst of both worlds, because I think the worst situation is a fully legal commercial market, but certainly a pretty bad one where states are uncertain about how to regulate marijuana. More importantly, states are in some senses irrationally exuberant about the proposition of legal weed. They think it will be a major boon to their tax bases. They think it will be essentially harmless to their communities. They think that weed will be the thing that they have long needed and that they've been held back from having access to by unfair, unjust, unreasonable laws. I think states are slowly starting to figure out that when you legalize marijuana, things get ugly. In some senses, what you would see outside if you walked, within a 5 square block radius, the dozens of, throughout the city, there are something like 1,500 unlicensed marijuana stores that are not only a visual blight but also cause crime. Those represent the sort of ambiguous status quo that we live under. States don't feel empowered to shut them down because they think enforcement is bad and racist. They also don't know how to regulate the markets such that they go away, and they also don't know what to do with markets, white markets, that emerge if they do go away. So it's sort of a mess, is the actual answer to the original question. I don't think full legalization would solve the issue. It would solve some of the problems, it would make other problems much worse, but it would be at least a little bit clearer. My view, my case for prohibition, is that it is extremely clear. Marijuana is illegal, you can't sell it, and that's the law of the land. There are costs to that, but those costs are substantially outweighed by the benefits of that arrangement.
Okay, Charles, you brought up racism, which seems appropriate here at Sovereign House. I am curious, then, do you think criminalization is racist?
I mean, I guess what I would say is I can make an argument that, like, anything the government does is kind of tinged with racism sometimes, right? Like, I think about marijuana prohibition was passed in the early 20th century, and many people involved in passage of marijuana prohibition were racists, to which the response is like, yeah, that's true. Most people before the, like, 1950s, 1960s believed derogatory things about black people. We don't let that affect, like, Social Security or Medicaid. That's later, but the point is that there is a naive sense in which you can argue that marijuana prohibition is racist. I can make those arguments. I don't think they're particularly persuasive or interesting. Whether or not, like, people had racist intents, whether or not there is some racial disparity in enforcement, ultimately those causes lie elsewhere. One thing that you observe is that in jurisdictions that legalize marijuana, the marijuana-related crimes that remain illegal, like selling to young adults or consuming underage, enforcement is still racially disproportionate, which we can debate about what that represents, but suggests that the legal status of marijuana is not what produces the outcomes. But more generally, whether or not it's racist just isn't that important of a variable in saying, is it good for our society if many more people are smoking pot versus not?
Jacob, agree or disagree?
Well, regardless of intention, the beginning of marijuana illegalization clearly had racist origins. And I don't think Charles disagrees with me with this. Anslinger bringing up Mexican crime as one of the main motivations to push the Marijuana Tax Act following the end of alcohol prohibition. So clearly there were racist things that were happening, and lots of drug laws throughout the United States have incredibly racist origins. An op-ed that was published in the New York Times was called the Negro Cocaine Fiend. You know, and clearly I don't need to talk much about what was written in that article for it to be clear, like, what was being signaled before cocaine was made illegal throughout the United States. So the intentions were definitely there at the beginning, but Charles does have a general point. Like, even if there are racist things happening, maybe going after the racism is the problem, and marijuana should still be illegal. That's, you know, I am sympathetic to that idea. It's like, well, if the policy is actually correct, let's just stop being racist about the policy. One thing we should understand, though, is that although the disparities maybe remain the same after legalization, still arrests go down. So if the disparities are the same, you still have fewer black people getting arrested. You know, maybe you had 10 people getting arrested before, and then you have one person getting arrested after. If the disparity's there, like, is the disparity actually important when you're considering how many fewer people are being harmed? At the end of the day, fewer black people are being arrested after legalization goes forward. That's incredibly clear. And one thing about, I don't know if this actually speaks to intentions, but it definitely speaks to impact. So if you look from 1980 to 1990, the Reagan administration increasingly started arresting people for selling marijuana and other drugs. As the number of arrests went up, proportionately, the proportion of black people who made up those arrests also went up. And then around 1991, the arrest rate went down, and the proportion of those arrests who were black went down. So I don't know what the intention is, but clearly it's had a relatively more devastating impact on the black families.
Can I respond to that?
You're definitely
Yeah. So
Go ahead.
Well, okay. So there are three things.
Go ahead.
Going earlier to talking about marijuana drug prohibition generally. I mean, so there's one article about Negro cocaine fiends. It's written by a prolific writer on the topic, by the way. But there's actually very little additional evidence that this is like a major motivator for cocaine prohibition. It's just like the one article. There's an interesting recent social history of this. Broader point, what people were responding to. Interestingly, alcohol prohibition was hotly contested in America. Other substance prohibition, not really even a democratic question. Everyone was basically like, yeah, this seems like a good idea. Maybe that was about racism, but they were also responding to real issues with the consumption of cocaine. Millions of Americans were addicted to cocaine at the time, and millions of Americans were addicted to heroin at the time. Harry Anslinger and Richard Nixon alike identified in marijuana a major problem that it caused people to go crazy and act in horrible ways. And indeed today, we are quite certain that marijuana-induced psychosis is a rare but serious effect of consuming marijuana. They were not nuts. They were talking about real drug problems. The proportion of black arrests and the total number of arrests rises under Ronald Reagan because they are prosecuting a specific component of the drug war, which is dealing with the crack crisis, the primary goal of which is incarcerating serious, violent crack-dealing offenders. The fact that they happen to incarcerate them for marijuana-related offenses is like, that's what they could get them on. In 1997, of all of the people who are incarcerated for drug-related offenses in, I forget what the total number of states with prisons, like all the states that respond to the relevant survey, 3% can plausibly be characterized as low-level, non-violent, just-use offenders. Everybody else has a history of criminal behavior, a history of use of weapons in a crime, is a member of a gang, or was committing another crime when they were arrested. They were fighting a major problem in the United States, which was crack-related violence. And they used marijuana as pretext. That's not what they were doing. This may be in the weeds. Wasn't a pun. It can be a pun. It's fine.
Sure. I think the weeds are expected here. Okay, well, we can move on, I guess, from racism, which isn't real and is totally made up, to something that's practical. Police.
The police are also not real.
Right, also not real. So I think it's important that we kind of get into these practical institutions that are affected by marijuana legalization or criminalization. So this is kind of a broad question because we're going broad and general, but what happens to police when marijuana is legalized? And is it positive or negative?
It's incredibly positive. So if you look at the number of homicides that happen at the state level following marijuana legalization, contrary to popular belief, tend to go down. If you look at crime clearance rates for crimes that are no longer marijuana related, those get cleared quicker. You just have a concentration of resources. You have finite resources that are given to your police. And then after it's legalized, you could focus on things that are actually important. So is there really any evidence that marijuana legalization leads to more crimes? No. In the case of homicides, it seems to go down. And police have more resources to go after things that aren't marijuana related. It's really that simple.
Actual levels of arrests go up substantially post-legalization, although that can be the case that that can be that police are substituting some other offense. Look, I think the strongest argument here is that police themselves often dislike marijuana legalization. They report this. I'm not convinced they're right. I don't think it has a huge impact. The reality is that marijuana offenses per se are not heavily policed in most jurisdictions in the United States. Most marijuana possession arrests are not about marijuana at all. What they're about is pretext. They're about, you see that somebody is smoking, you want a pretext to arrest them because you know that they are up to no good, and so you stop them, you frisk them, you find illicit contraband, you can arrest them. That gets recorded as a marijuana arrest, but it's not really the purpose of the arrest. Part of the reason that arrests go up following legalization, part of the reason that matters is because if there's a criminal justice harm of marijuana prohibition, then those pretext stops should go down and not get substituted for something else. Instead, the cops start arresting more people for different stuff. I don't ultimately find persuasive the idea that the cops have a lot to complain about with marijuana legalization. Like, the problem is a public health one, not really a criminal one. But I am also not persuaded that there's a big boon to them.
Okay. New problem. Traffic accidents.
They go up, it's a problem. But
I agree.
it really is a problem. But it's a predictable problem. And there are various ways to address marijuana-related traffic accidents that go up, right? What do we do with alcohol? We started arresting people for drunk driving. Drunk driving accidents went down, and they're at a reasonably tolerable, stable level now. And once we develop the technology to figure out who's high while they're driving, and there are some very cool, innovative ways of doing that, we'll be able to enforce those laws better.
We don't have it yet, and it's a much harder proposition than testing whether people have been recently drinking. It's much harder to tell if people have been recently consuming marijuana versus if they at some point consumed it in the recent past, but they are not actively intoxicated. That's it, no. Ultimately we will get there. This is an innovation problem, and capitalism is great and really good at innovation. We'll get there. I do think that we have an intolerably high level of alcohol-involved deaths on the roads. That's a serious issue. We have good evidence that zero-tolerance policies in this space reduce road deaths. They are a major benefit. I might question on a cultural level whether we will have the appetite for zero-tolerance enforcement of marijuana-intoxicated driving, whether we will have the appetite for cops stopping people and giving them major tickets or arresting them because they are intoxicated. Because the general trajectory, one of the major problems that we face with marijuana today is that we are unwilling to regulate or enforce around it. The ideal thing to do when you open a new marijuana market, a legal marijuana market, is to dramatically increase enforcement to keep unlicensed sellers out. But the political reality is that we don't want to do that. And I think the same story is there for marijuana. So, I think we'll solve the technical problem. I'm not convinced that we will solve something like 1,400 additional road deaths a year thus far. That's the best estimate for current levels of legalization. That'll get bigger as more states legalize. I think that's not the most important cost, but it is a pretty big one. I would like it if 1,400 people didn't die every year. I'm against that.
It seems positive.
Yeah, and to put that in perspective, approximately 10,000 people a year die from alcohol-related accidents on the road. That's a lot. It's also a lot more, and we are willing to tolerate it. And tell you what, I'm pro marijuana legalization and pro zero tolerance when it comes to these driving issues, and they should be enforced. And you can have legalization and policies in place to account for externalities that affect other people.
That's the question, right? Can you, in fact, politically have those things? I think it's unclear what are the jurisdictions, particularly in the United States, that have indicated a willingness to do this.
Well, this is completely just independent of even marijuana legalization. This is a problem that we've been seeing throughout the United States. And if there's no appetite to enforce our laws, then even marijuana legalization itself is irrelevant.
Well,
right?
so here's, and we can move on, but I think this is getting to sort of a core point. Here is the case for drug prohibition in a single word. It's stupid. Americans are very bad. American systems of governance are very bad at implementing elaborate, complicated regulatory schemes. We lack both the competency and the will. We don't like that. We live in small local democracies. We like it when people have their say, and that's terrible. We hate bureaucracy. There's one of my favorite examples of this is, thinking about setting marijuana prices. You have a marijuana state store. How do you set marijuana prices? Who are the agencies responsible for this? And there's a great proposal that's like, we need to have a Federal Reserve Board just for setting marijuana prices so we can figure out the optimal price. And look at this is not going to happen in an American institutional context, not remotely. Part of the virtue of prohibition is that it's stupid. The rule is you can't have this thing. It's very easy to enforce that rule. This is something of a pessimist position. This is not the only reason I think prohibition is good. But one of its virtues is we are very bad at implementing complicated regimes. Perhaps we should consider the stupid ones.
I agree with you that we should consider the stupid ones. And an even easier policy to put in place is just allow people to have marijuana.
Silence.
No, it seemed like a good stopping point. I disagree because pot's bad.
Sure. We'll get into why it is great. Okay, another practical issue for something that's very real. We talked about this a little bit earlier today, so I'm curious how you guys have evolved on this in the last 2 hours. Has marijuana, or has it not, played a role in our current mental health crisis?
Do you want this?
I can go first.
You're the one with the PhD in public health.
So are there specific individuals who are negatively affected by using marijuana? Yes. Does marijuana use go up amid legalization? Also yes. But if you look at various mental health indicators at the state level after legalization goes forward, both medical and recreational, they're relatively stable. They don't go down, but they're relatively stable, except for one, and that is the suicide rate among young men. Now, when papers on this were originally published, people were thinking, oh, is it the marijuana that's maybe being used as an antidepressant effectively? Is it preventing young men from killing themselves? And that doesn't seem to be the case. What seems to be the case is that the people who are most likely to get arrested for marijuana, aka young men, are getting arrested for marijuana less often, and they tend not to be in a position where they feel like their life is falling apart. So even though marijuana can have a detrimental impact on various individuals and their mental health states, there doesn't seem to be much evidence that it's leading, that the states that have legalized marijuana are having disproportionately worse mental health outcomes, despite mental health outcomes throughout the United States definitely getting worse. But it doesn't seem to be related to the legalization of marijuana. And there are second order effects of not prosecuting individuals and potentially ruining their lives, and their lives just being better, and that being reflected in suicide rates.
Let's see the suicide rate paper, because that sounds like pee hacking.
I'm replicating it so you can...
Okay, we'll talk about that. A subset of a subset has a significant effect. Okay. And we can come up with a just so story about why. No, I mean, I would not expect to see substantial effects because the acute mental health and chronic mental health harms of marijuana are real but relatively rare. They're not going to show up in, like, state-level surveys of the sort that we're talking about. The samples aren't going to be big enough, which is, like, important, right? Like, the effects are not ultimately that big. The most persuasive evidence says marijuana causally increases your risk for schizophrenia, particularly heavy marijuana use, particularly in adolescence. The best estimate is, all else being equal, it's about a 30% increase in your risk, but that's a 30% increase over a very small base rate, so it's like about 1% of the population will develop schizophrenia. It's like 1.3% if you're a heavy marijuana user. Lots of other factors are relevant. There's less good evidence for things like anxiety, depression. There a lot seems to matter on how you take it, but none of the evidence is overwhelmingly persuasive. It makes a difference. I think it's important that there is a trend of consuming marijuana as quote-unquote self-medication, for which it's not indicated and is not really necessarily an appropriate response. But I'd say what's actually important is that the primary mental health harms of marijuana come from when it is used as intended, which is that it's an intoxicant and a depressant, right? Like a friend of mine refers to marijuana as a performance-degrading drug. Everybody knows somebody like that, right? Everybody
Performance
knows
enhancing.
Yeah, well, right. Everyone knows somebody who consumes marijuana compulsively, who uses too much of it, who spends most of their days in haze, who is dysfunctional, who can't get to work. Those people are not, well, there's people with substance use disorder, which is a mental health issue, but those people are not dealing with mental illness in the way that we were talking about earlier, but their lives are appreciably worse off. And the number of those people goes up substantially when marijuana becomes legalized. So that's, and the intensity of their use goes up substantially when marijuana becomes legalized. That's, my primary concern is marijuana, when used as affected, has serious harms on individuals, independent of second-order unintended consequences. Mental health.
Okay, so you guys have kind of, I guess, circled around this, but marijuana, gateway drug, yes or no?
I don't know. Look, I think the research is equivocal. Some evidence says yes, some evidence says no. A lot of it says who knows. And then the question is, what does gateway mean? Does gateway mean if you take marijuana, a fairy comes down and says, you're 10% more likely to use drugs? Does gateway mean you're more likely to hang out with people who use harder drugs if you use marijuana? Does gateway mean you're more likely to have social networks? That's all potentially true. The effect is probably not big enough for it to matter. But it's okay, because marijuana is bad enough on its own, is harmful enough on its own, that we're not better off with it being legal, independent of its risk for heroin use. If the only argument I can muster is that some people who smoke marijuana also use heroin, that's not a good argument in my opinion.
There are various types of drugs that are potentially more harmful than marijuana. So if marijuana is a gateway drug, I think that'd be a fantastic argument against its legalization. And the way that I think about it theoretically would actually indicate that it is a gateway drug. And the way I think about it is kind of like how we would approve drugs. Like you do a randomized controlled trial. And if I could convince a person to genuinely change who they are and be okay with using marijuana, would they relatively from that previous position be more likely to use cocaine, heroin, or any other drug? And intuitively, I think probably. But all of that kind of comes tumbling down when you look at what's been happening in the drug use data. So marijuana has been legalized. Part of the reason why it's become legalized is because more people are using it, so that actually gets you the political power to legalize it. And then part of it is legalization happens, and then the cost goes down, and then if it's cheaper, more people will end up using it as well. But marijuana use is going up. Despite opioid overdoses going up, do you know what's been happening to opioid use? It's been going down. Cocaine use has been relatively stable. So if it was a gateway drug, and we have more people using it, why don't we see massive increases or reasonably consistent increases in those other drugs? So I don't think the data support where my intuition is on that, which is why this field is so... That's why it goes in both directions, right? The evidence is very mixed.
Yeah, I do think there's an interesting corollary here. One of the really interesting things that happens is not on the demand side, but on the supply side. So marijuana legalization introduces white market or gray market actors into the equation. They have lots of benefits over the black market actors. They have access to, they kind of have access to U.S. capital, sort of. It's complicated. Sometimes they get coverage, they get state level safe banking, they get coverage for taxes. They sort of operate above the law. They aren't cartels. They don't have to deal with the cost of cartels. And so one group that marijuana legalization has been bad for is the cartels. They are, to some extent, exist in the domestic market. But the thing is that cartels are large, complicated businesses. And so when you need to establish a portfolio of products, and when one product goes away, you substitute to other products. One explanation for why cartels have diversified into such novel technologies as synthetic drugs like fentanyl is because marijuana became no longer a profitable area for them. So, there are unintended consequences on both sides of the equation. Yes, you see what we've seen. It's a little hard to tell what the trend is in opioid use rate. You can look at the national survey data, but those are pretty unreliable and going to overselect your pill use. But it does seem like the rate of overdose death has risen much more than the rate of use. But the rate of the increase in overdose death is attributable to the change in what the cartels are selling. Is that all because pot was legal? No. Did that help the situation? Also no.
So just to be clear, you're making the case that marijuana legalization is exacerbating the opioid crisis. Just being clear.
Depends on what you're trying to measure.
Is it causing more death?
My claim is that part of what caused the fentanyl transition in the United States is the decline in profitability of marijuana.
And we know fentanyl is causing death, so you're saying it's causing death. I just trying to be clear on this point.
Not in the same sense that, if I smoked some marijuana and died, it caused
No, the
death.
public policy implications. You legalized it, and a bunch of stuff happened, and then drugs in the opioid space got more dangerous. Is that the point?
That is a point. That is one way to interpret the point.
Okay, just making sure that was the point.
Do you have a follow-up?
Yeah,
You going somewhere with that?
I am going somewhere with that.
Okay.
Yeah, anything you can do to reduce the revenue for black markets and illicit markets is good. Illicit markets are the #1 cause of homicide throughout the country, and that's probably the best argument for legalizing not only marijuana, but drugs in general. That's a different debate that we can repeat another time.
There's no measure by which illicit markets are the #1 cause of homicide throughout the country.
Are they not mostly gang related?
First of all, gang-related homicides are not all illicit market-related homicides. Most gangs are not involved.
Gangs are inherently illicit markets.
They are not.
What?
Okay.
That's why they're gangs.
Gangs are groups of violent teenagers. This has been established this is like the original criminological finding. The idea that gangs are primarily market actors is a product of the cocaine or the crack cocaine years. And then they got out of the game too, largely because Mexican providers discovered that American teenagers are terrible at selling drugs. They would much rather have their own guys do it, which is what they do now. Now I'm yelling. This is a little in the weeds, sorry.
It is a little in the weeds. I think it's a little fun, though. Yeah, no, I guess I would
The market for marijuana, by the way, is relatively nonviolent.
Now it is.
No, it was
Because
always
it's
nonviolent.
increasingly...
Because it's large.
No, you had massive marijuana trafficking across our border when there was, earlier I said marijuana isn't technically legal. That's technically true, but states are tolerating regulated markets. So regulated producers are making marijuana, and as that increases, the amount of marijuana that comes over the border, aka from illicit cartels, has been going way, way down. And there's clearly violence. Maybe not the teenage violence, but there's clearly violence associated with those drugs making it over here.
I mean, if we're talking about violence in Mexico, that's true.
Yeah, and that's also important.
Okay, so two
Yeah.
things are true. First of all, that's a different policy consideration, right?
Sure, but also in the
my
United States. I want to be clear that in the United States, yes, I also say it's going down because of that. But go.
I don't think that's true. I think that in general, when you talk to importantly, the marginal marijuana dealer looks different from the marginal cocaine dealer, the marginal heroin dealer in surveys when people talk to or about their dealers. The marginal marijuana dealer is some guy that you know. And if anyone here has bought pot prior to its legalization, they probably know that this is true. There are people up the supply chain, but mostly they are not in the United States. They are in Mexico. Because the market is much bigger and because the average user is much more casual, they are much less willing to deal with a violent market. It's also the case that drug market violence has declined precipitously since the 1990s for a variety of reasons, including increased incapacitation and the shutting down of criminal enterprises, but also innovations like the pager, and then later the internet. We've just made them much less violent. The idea that drug markets are intrinsically violent is an artifact of the crack cocaine crisis. It's just not true. It is violent in Mexico. Here's why. The Mexicans have no state capacity. They do not govern the northern half of their country. First of all, that is not fundamentally my problem. I'm a little bit concerned about it. I don't think that we should legalize drugs to correct it.
For being a little concerned.
But let's be clear about what the cartels are again, right? They aren't like single producers of marijuana. They are diversified business interests with guns. Cartels don't just sell drugs. They traffic in like ivory. The cartels traffic in endangered animals. Like if you'd like to buy, if you go out on the streets and like somebody's trying to sell you an elephant, that probably came from the cartels. It'd be a little weird, but that's neither here nor there. The problem in dealing with the cartels at that level has much less to do with like which things we legalize, sort of like legalizing all illicit products, which you may favor, but most people in the room will not. You will continue to have these robust businesses, like somebody's got to do something about them at the level of force. Again, that's like ultimately the Mexicans' problem. We can talk about how we could help them if they're willing to accept our help, which they are not. But like you don't solve it by changing by affecting the legal status of one product.
Yeah, so I want to just focus again like on the logic of removing one type of market from the cartels could possibly make things worse. Like, should we allow cartels to start participating more in prostitution so that they make the other markets that they're participating in like safer? Should we give cartels more access to market in order to make various things safer? Because if they don't have such markets, they're going to start focusing on other markets, and that's what eventually makes them dangerous. I think when it comes to cartels, you just destroy them by any means possible. Anything you can do to reduce their revenue is absolutely a good thing, and marijuana legalization has led to that. And on Charles' point about
bigger than they were before mass legalization.
And on Charles's point about does your weed dealer also deal cocaine? You know, I don't smoke marijuana anymore, but you know, my last couple of years of my econ master's program, I was smoking daily. And wait, is this recorded? Or we have to bleep that part out. Yeah, we'll edit it. Man. Oh, I shouldn't have said that. Anyways, almost every single dealer I dealt with had the cocaine ready. Like I don't know which dealers you're talking to, but like these things happen together. They definitely do. And why is fentanyl killing so many people? And why is like dual drug use or dual drug consumption such a large cause of death? Like why are cocaine deaths going up? It's not because cocaine is that dangerous to consume or you have that high of a probability of overdosing on cocaine. It's because fentanyl is contaminating the cocaine supply because these things tend to be in the same place. These are supplied by the same people, and various things get mixed up and whatnot. And fentanyl, because it's not a green leaf, it contaminating marijuana isn't that big of an issue. But these things happen to happen together. And the violence that's associated with any sort of drug market is going to be associated with marijuana or any other thing that's in the illicit market.
Okay, that might be a good place to stop this. Unless you have like 2 sentences you want to say, Charles.
It's not just adulteration with fentanyl. People also consciously choose to engage in polysubstance use. You can, they will attest to this. Also, they also just
that's true,
yeah.
But there is a lot more unintentional fentanyl overdose among people who are just trying to do cocaine now too. It's both.
Okay, all right, let's move on. I want to ask one more question before I turn it over to you guys for Q&A. So the big one, why would prohibition work when it clearly failed with alcohol?
Well, I started, so you can start this time.
I reject the premise of the question. Look, alcohol prohibition ended for 2 reasons. One is that we wanted the tax revenue because we were in the middle of the Great Depression. And the second reason is that everyone just sort of got fed up with it. And it's democratically unpopular. Americans like to drink. 70%, I forget the numbers. It's something like 70% of Americans drink. Another, I think it's 10 or 20% say it's moral to drink, although they themselves do not. It's just like opposing alcohol prohibition is just like supporting alcohol prohibition is a political non-starter in our democracy. I drink occasionally. I obviously have no moral issue with it. But it's really hard to make the argument that prohibition didn't work. It's like this is sort of a canard and doesn't hold up. Your old boss, Jeff Myron, has shown that alcohol consumption declined precipitously under Prohibition, probably 60 to 70% in the early years, and then back up to about 30% of its 30% relative decline once they basically stopped enforcing it, which they did almost immediately because the Volstead Act was an enormous mess. It is very hard to argue that homicide went up. If you look at states, there's no national data. The national data are unreliable. But if you look at state-level prohibition prior to national prohibition, there's no effect on homicide of alcohol prohibition. People had more money in their pocket. There were all sorts of tangible and intangible health benefits. Alcohol prohibition, by the way, was like a fairly liberal prohibition. Possession was effectively decriminalized under the Volstead Act. You could have alcohol in your home. It was presumptively legal. You were presumed to have a good reason for it unless they could show otherwise. The long and the short of it is like, I don't think it's worth talking about was the 21st Amendment a mistake. That's, fantasy land. We have alcohol today. But it's also very hard, in my view, to argue that alcohol prohibition was not a success by the metric of did it improve public health, did it make people better off, because alcohol is an extremely harmful drug. And the fact that we had success with prohibition, and the fact that alcohol today is implicated in 140,000 deaths a year, more than the number of deaths caused by illicit drugs, should give us pause about saying alcohol prohibition didn't work, therefore we should get rid of a prohibition on another harmful addictive substance.
There's a few points to address there. So when we're trying to evaluate the effect of an intervention on any sort of outcome, in this case I'm going to bring up homicides and crime, it's really hard to do that with national level data because it goes into effect, there's really nothing to compare it to. The very interesting and convenient thing about marijuana liberalization, let's say, is that it's happened state by state, it's happened staggeredly, so we generally understand what follows. We at least know on average what tends to follow. There's various things that can bias these estimates, but we at least have a place to start. But when you're looking at what happened with prohibition, I think it's pretty clear that violence, it has a net increase on violence. But the same, this is just theoretical. So I guess I don't have, because of what I just described with marijuana, we don't have that type of evidence, so I can't make that strong claim. But making that claim in any direction doesn't make sense. And what it definitely did was increase black market activity. And why were federal regulators so gun-ho about going after Al Capone and various people who were operating in Chicago and whatnot? It's what brought the Kennedys so much wealth for a long time, right? It did. No, it really did. And there was a lot of things going on there that needed to be stopped. And no, it seems pretty clear it was a bad idea because lots of people kept drinking. Well, you're just going to put that into a gray zone area and then arbitrarily enforce against people you don't like? No, that's not what you should do. And even though you were making the point earlier that most people think alcohol is moral, including yourself, and that's a motivating factor. Well, just because marijuana is a minority of people doesn't mean that their opinion is less relevant. It's still about 25% of the population that consumes marijuana at least once a month, and somewhere north of 50 is cool with it being legalized too. So it seems quite significant enough to justify why you should allow people to do things, because if you don't want them to do things, it's going to require a lot of resources to try to stop them. 25% of the population is still a lot. So how many resources are you actually going to put forward to stop that? With alcohol prohibition, we realized that was a bad idea, and we're now learning that it was also a bad idea with marijuana.
I can't wait, but
Go.
Prohibition violence is propaganda invented by J. Edgar Hoover to get more federal dollars. It just is. We have two reasons to believe that there was serious violence during Prohibition. One is that there was a lot of schlock coverage of gangsters and Al Capone, which was wildly dressed up by the media. In part at Hoover's intervention. Beverly Gage's recent biography of Hoover, G-Man, which is quite good and I highly recommend, goes into this in detail. How Hoover took advantage of the media. The second reason we have is that homicides increased precipitously in the national data following Prohibition. Jacob is making the claim that we can't tell if this is real or not, and that's right, because we don't have a comparison group. The thing that I would add is that many of those homicides are car crashes, because they weren't counted as a separate category until much later in the data. Who was the person who collected the national homicide data in the 1930s? It's J. Edgar Hoover. I'm down on Hoover, which makes me the odd one in this conversation. Pros and cons to Hoover. In certain regards, he's a great American. He did hate communism. And I respect that. So this isn't really the point. The point is about democratic legitimacy. Look, I live in a state. Sorry, I'm up here from Maryland. I live in a state where we just legalized marijuana. I think it was a mistake. I was one of the 33% of Marylanders who voted against marijuana legalization. I think it was bad. I say so publicly. I'm doing it right now. My point is that we live in a democracy. I think I'm probably going to lose this one. I don't think it will be the end of the world when I do. I think it will be a slightly worse country for me and my children. And I don't like that, and I like to say that publicly. My point about alcohol is, can I imagine a day in which we have the fervor of the early 20th century prohibitionist movement? We recognize how insanely bad alcohol is for our society. Yeah, maybe could happen. It's not going to happen right now. It's not really worth talking about. I'm no great moralizer in this area, but I suspect that if I could wave a magic wand and make it go away, I would. My point is that, I live within the constraints imposed upon me by democratic reality. I'm willing to do that for marijuana when the fight's over, but we're not there yet. So, slow your roll. That's a pun.
So you support the 21st Amendment, or 21st, 20th.
21st is repeal.
Yeah, 21st is repeal of the 20th. Yeah, so you support the 20th.
18 is prohibition. 21st is repeal.
Oh, thank you.
You got to know these things because on Prohibition Day, all the bars have specials, and they always talk to the 18th Amendment, the 21st Amendment. Anyway, I don't think it's worth talking about should we get rid of the 21st Amendment for the same reason I don't think it's worth talking about should we have a king. I don't know. There might be certain virtues to having like King Donald Trump. It would be very entertaining. I think he'd be great at it, but I'll pitch people on that afterwards. He's a ceremonial figure. He could go around. He wouldn't have any power. It'd be wonderful. It'd be hilarious. The libs would be so owned. But that's not really a conversation worth having except as a joke. In much the same way, ultimately my response when people say, but alcohol is legal, shouldn't that justify the legalization of marijuana is, well, just because one harmful addictive substance is legal is not actually a reason that another harmful addictive substance should also be legal.
Any response? No? All right. To you all. If you have a question, obviously raise your hand. Okay, we have several. Okay, I'm gonna start from back to front because.
So one of the things with alcohol was that there was effective restraints put on how strong the alcohol was. I mean, if you go into a liquor store now.
I'm sorry, that was very rude. That wasn't really at you. That was at the Alki and Allen theorem. I apologize.
But what I'm asking is that one of the problems with weed is that incidences of weed-induced psychosis have increased, particularly for people between the ages of 16 and 25. So there is an issue with how strong weed is, and I wonder if there's a lesson that you can learn from how they regulated alcohol and made it such that you would be able to understand how strong the alcohol you were consuming was. I don't know if it's a question for the illegal side. I understand it's kind of irrelevant, but I'm curious for Jacob, you're supporting legalization. How would you deal with regulating the strength of weed? Because if anyone smoked weed in the past 10 years, it's gotten crazy.
So yeah, marijuana has definitely gotten more potent during the course of legalization. Is there a place for regulation that could force labeling of what's actually in the product and accurate labeling and hold suppliers responsible if it's not accurate? Sure. And that's all within the context of marijuana being legal. And that's one of the parts of drug legalization that leads to safer use at the time of use of drugs. You know what you're putting into your body. You typically know what you can handle. And if you know both of those things, the drug use actually becomes safer. And although marijuana has become more potent over the last 10 years or so as it's become more liberalized and we've had more regulated providers, we actually have a new phenomenon going on. Lots of people don't like the crazy stuff. In fact, I think most people don't like the crazy stuff. And what I've seen more in the markets is these it's almost like the craft beer of weed. It's super low potent, maybe around 5 to 7% THC potency, and it's supposed to give you a much lighter effect. And as the markets emerge, those are the types of products that come. Do most people drink Everclear with alcohol? They don't. That'd be absurd. In fact, the most popular drink, well, until that recent advertising campaign, was Bud Light, right? There's no alcohol in that. So don't be too concerned about the initial reflexive things that the marijuana industry has done. The fact of the matter is that most suppliers of marijuana are not profitable and they go out of business. And they're actually figuring out what people want at the moment.
Can I happen?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so the thing I was objecting to earlier is the so-called iron law of prohibition, right? This is a formulation by Richard Clarence Cowan, the marijuana legalization activist, nice guy, I spoke to him recently, who argues that legalization increases potency because it's easier to smuggle a more potent per dose product. And this process is like
Illegal, yeah.
yes, right. Prohibition increases potency. And this process is like that is one effect, but there are lots of other effects. What we're observing in the marijuana market is that legalization does two things. One is that it introduces innovation into the market. Like, yes, there are 5 to 7% THC products, but that was just all in marijuana 30 years ago. Actually, the average potency in marijuana seized by the DEA in the early 90s was like 4%. So like the low grade stuff is still more potent than the stuff that was available under prohibition. It's also the case, so innovation is part of what allows, even very simple innovation, is part of what allows the production of these high THC products. You have that innovation in a legal market. But the second point is that when you ask industry participants, when you go read the trade publications, they will say it is the consumer who is asking for this. Yes, he's right that the average alcohol consumer drinks Bud Light. The average unit of alcohol consumed is not Bud Light. The average unit of alcohol consumed is as high potency as possible because the average unit of alcohol consumed is consumed by people who do most of the consumption, people who are addicted to alcohol. The same thing is true of marijuana. Most marijuana consumption, something between 60 and 80%, is consumed by heavy daily users. Those people are highly dependent on THC. They have a marijuana use disorder. They're addicted to marijuana. And those people demand a higher potency product. And it is catering to those people, selling them things that hurt them, that is the basic problem of the marijuana market.
Yeah, I just very quick on that. So the general point that it's Pareto distributed, the idea that a small amount of people can make up the majority of use, that's obviously true. But when we look at these alcohol consumption numbers, be very careful because alcohol is purchased in a way that it could look like it's very heavy use. But do most people here do shots, or do they end up mixing their drink and diluting it? So keep that in mind when we think about the data on the consumption and what's purchased and what is consumed.
Okay, all right, we're going to keep going from the back. So, yeah, you.
So I guess this question is for Jacob, although Charles, I want your response too. What do you make of Emily Owen's work, which if I'm remembering it correctly, suggests that a lot of the increase in violence during alcohol prohibition was really a result of urbanization, and obviously he found that when control would actually explain a lot of the growth in homicide from the state to state level.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with her work on that, but that seems incredibly plausible. Just like the increase in marijuana enforcement leading to disparate impact could consequently be the effect that minorities are disproportionately represented in urban areas. And if that's where you're increasing the police presence, it doesn't necessarily need to be intentional for those communities to be disparately impacted. So sure, of course, all sorts of outside exogenous factors might actually describe why violence went up with prohibition. What I can tell you is that violence significantly goes down after marijuana legalization, though. And that's much easier to isolate.
Any response?
No.
Okay, all right. Yeah.
Okay, so I thought this was a really compelling debate, partially because I'm from Washington State, which was one of the first 2 states to legalize it, and my opinion on it has switched since then. That I was in favor of it then, I was a stupid teenager. Now I've matured and I've changed my opinion on it, partially because I've seen the effects of it firsthand. It felt like I was kind of sold a false bill of goods when they were pushing for legalization. That 2 of the biggest arguments were it's not going to create new smokers, it's just going to be people who are already using it, are just going to buy it legally rather than not. That's totally not true. Anecdotally, I don't have studies to show this, but I know just from my life that there are plenty of 40, 50-year-old professionals who otherwise would never have smoked, who now can because in the past they wouldn't have known anyone who sold it, but now they just go to the store and buy it like liquor. So like that argument was totally bogus. And then the other one is more again with the concentration subject is that I think it was also kind of deceptive that a lot of the studies they used to justify legalization at the time was, like Charles was saying, based on stuff that was used in the 80s and 90s that is like an order of magnitude weaker than it is now. So it's hardly even the same drug. I've seen multiple people I know in my life personally who have actually suffered marijuana use psychosis. It's certainly not a pretty thing to happen. So I worry that the same arguments. I don't know what the campaign was in Maryland, but I imagine they used a lot of the same arguments that they did in Washington. I guess this is probably for Charles. How do you think we can, change people's minds on this? Because I think we're going to continue seeing a lot of people making these same arguments that aren't true.
Yeah. So I mean, there's an interesting point about marijuana-induced psychosis and marijuana addiction more generally, right? So like, there has now been non-trivial mainstream publication coverage of marijuana addiction. You read almost nothing about it until 4 or 5 years ago. And partially that is like, reporters starting to do their due diligence and waking up to health reality. Physicians have talked about it for decades. But the reality is that it is much more prevalent because the product is much more potent. The risk is increasing and will continue to be true. One concern I have about the increase in use is, in the short run, you may expect a relatively small increase in use. That only tells you so much about the long run effects of legalization, of shifts in the norms around the consumption of marijuana. Look, here's my optimistic case as somebody who thinks that the political battle is 90% lost. First of all, my best ally on this front is President Joe Biden, God bless him, who is the only thing holding back the dam, and who I think in his heart of hearts genuinely believes that marijuana is very bad and is trying his hardest to convince the rest of his party who thinks he's crazy. He is going to die in -4 to -5 years. And then, they'll elect another Democrat, President AOC will legalize it, and that'll be the end of the story. And it will be a mess. Here is my optimistic case. In the meantime, at the very least, I can keep making my arguments in public and hope that it has an impact, and hope that it slows state-level rollout. My hope is that eventually we will treat marijuana like we treat cigarettes. Something that is legal, something that is regarded as déclassé, harmful, deserving of social disapprobation and shame when we consume it. I would prefer that it was illegal, but I think that the sort of best case scenario conditioning on the assumption that prohibition will end is, once we start to learn what marijuana is really like as a substance, we will harden on it substantially. That, by the way, is something that policy can play a role in much the same way that policy played a substantial role in making cigarettes unpopular and making the public health case against cigarettes. So there's stuff you can do there, but right now, I'll sort of keep making the argument, when I lose, that's my next step.
Yeah, I will first acknowledge that lots of lies were put forward to justify the liberalization of marijuana throughout the country, and similar types of lies were told to decriminalize drugs in Oregon. Now, my position that it's overall the correct policy and that the benefits outweigh the negative effects, I'll stand by that completely, but there definitely is a major issue with dishonest people working in advocacy, but it happens with advocacy with everything, and special interest of everything. That's just the nature of politics, and it's very unfortunate that good-willed people voted thinking that various things were going to happen, and those things did not manifest. It's very sad.
All right, more questions. Grace, you've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, for you, Jacob.
Oh, thanks.
Why did you stop smoking pot?
He's never smoked pot. There's no evidence that he's smoked pot.
I don't recall.
Why would your hypothetical friend stop?
He can talk about why I stopped smoking.
That's less compelling.
Honestly, I just stopped doing a whole bunch of relatively destructive things when I was younger. I think I just became an adult.
So you would consider it a relatively destructive thing?
The way that the way that some people do, I think overuse of any sort of substance, including alcohol, is destructive. And lots of things can turn into destructive behavior. And I was busy, and there was other things that I wanted to focus my time on. And that should not prevent someone else from focusing their time on using marijuana if they want to. But personally, my preferences weren't there. And just because I feel that way doesn't mean that I would use the law, the gun, and threaten someone with criminal prosecution to prevent them from doing something that, relative to other things that we should actually be enforcing, like murders and whatnot, is relatively benign.
All right, how about you?
Well, first of all, I am completely on board with the idea that America should have a constitutional monarchy. We Brits did our best on that front a few hundred years ago, and you were quite grateful, but anyway. I think I'm very supportive of young voices and everything that they stand for, but I do think this debate had a kind of fundamental weakness, which is it's really hard to unpick any of the effects. You're all talking about like a bazillion unintended consequences, things that might offset other things, whatever. Like, realistically, we don't know anything about anything. What we do know is where I work from home, at home, I can smell weed during the day, and it pisses me off, to be honest. And that's like a real, I know that's true. I don't know what the hell's going on with crime or immigration or cartels or any of this bullshit, but what I know is annoying. It's worse here than it was in London, where we don't, well, you know, whatever. It's worse. Why don't we just make decisions based on what we can see, smell, taste, whatever, ban it, get rid of it, job done.
So first of all, I would be perfectly fine. You can have Donald Trump as your constitutional monarch. That's all right with me. Do you want to go first?
You started.
Yeah, well, so look, I ultimately don't find it smells bad to be that persuasive if there are costs on the other side, right? Like, the reason I'm sitting up here and talking, we're both doing this. And by the way, something I appreciate, Jacob, is that he's willing to do this. I'll say that. You know, like, I was glad that he was the guy I was arguing with, because there are a lot of people on the other side who are stupid, and he's not. So he's willing to do the cost and benefit thing, because it's a hard question. Like, you know, if the options were like, it doesn't smell like marijuana, but also like shoot a lot of people in the street, I would prefer it smelled like marijuana. Trade-offs. That said, I think it's actually really telling that you bring that up. Every time I talk to people about pot, especially in New York, they say to me, invariably, this is the only conversation I have, you know, legalization sounded like a good idea to me, but now it just smells like weed everywhere. And I go, well, yeah, what did you expect? Once it's legal, you can consume it. You know, I think it's telling how tenuous the case for legalization was, based as it was on ultimately sort of like intangible thing. The case for legalization is actually not about the status of pot at all. It's about like fictions about how marijuana enforcement is racist, and like it's 7 million black men are in prison because they smoked a joint. And I think it's important that once people actually start to experience marijuana legalization, they go, oh wow, this is actually quite unpleasant. I don't like living in this society. And we should make laws to create societies that we like living in. I agree with that.
No, I have to address this. Yeah, so first of all, Charles and I think, agree on 85% of the facts. Is that about right?
Yeah,
somewhere around there?
Yeah.
So I think most of the things I've been saying, like, well, the truthfulness, or at least as we understand it, that's not much debated. There's various other data I could discuss where it is up for debate, and we've discussed up here various things that are up for debate, just like the idea that marijuana exposure might increase your likelihood of using other drugs. Like, that's up for debate, and we had a whole discussion all about that. And yes, there are negative consequences of the legalization of many things. And you smelling marijuana is something that is obviously true, and everyone is experiencing that throughout the city of New York. That's something that's happening. But does that justify throwing people in jail. Does that justify? No, really. I mean, you're shaking your head as if that's like not a big deal, but it destroys lives. Millions of people get arrested throughout the United States for it. And maybe they don't go to prison. Maybe they're relatively like let off, but is it on their record? Yes. Does it prevent them from federal employment and often state level employment forever? Yes. And you're doing that to millions of people. And is that, no, really, like.
But your whole point earlier was like police have a fixed amount of capacity, and when they stop doing this, they investigate other crimes. So by what you were saying earlier, this isn't leading to an increase in arrests. It's just leading to a displacement of who is arrested and what the police choose to focus on. So I just think this is all too.
No. That's absolutely absurd what you just said. No. Millions of arrests for drugs go down, and other crimes, their prevalence rates are much less. They're much more extreme, and we care about them more, but there's fewer arrests for murders than there are for marijuana arrests. It's not like we're completely making it up one for one. We're just focusing our resources.
So here's the thing, right? It's actually not, so we can quibble at the facts there, but I want to make a bigger point. It's actually not the case that there's a binary here. There's not like a policy binary where it's either if you smoke a joint, you get shot in the head in a trial, or, this is my go-to example, a lot of people get shot in the head, no trial in my hypotheticals, or either that, or marijuana is legal, you can buy it at the candy store for a nickel. Like, those aren't the only two options. There's a broad spectrum of policy options in the middle, none of which American policymakers are interested in, because again, American policymakers are quite stupid. Here in the great state of New York, since 1970, I forget if it's 3 or 7, since the 1970s, marijuana possession has been formally decriminalized. You cannot go to prison for marijuana possession. Up until the early 1990s, there were basically no marijuana arrests in the state of New York. In I think it's 1992, in the last year of the Dinkins administration, I forget the year, there were like 700 marijuana arrests in the city of New York. It's like nothing. What changed, and this is really in the weeds, so the original law has a loophole, which is that consuming, it's called the public view loophole. Consuming marijuana in public view is itself it's like it's either a Class C felony or Class A misdemeanor. You can get jailed for that. During Giuliani and Bloomberg administrations, this was an extremely convenient pretext for stop and frisk. They would see people smoking, or they would go up to people and be like, "Hey, what's that in your pocket? Turn your pockets." And then they would have a blunt in their pocket, and they go, "Oh, that's marijuana in public view. You're in violation of law. We're booking you." That was a concerted policy choice, right? That was abuse of the law. That was use of the law to achieve an independent end. First of all, they can't do that anymore because of the Floyd settlement. They just can't do stop and frisk at that level anymore. Second of all, in 2019, 2 years before they legalized, New York closed the loophole. They got rid of it. I think there are pros and cons to marijuana decriminalization, but let's be honest, it is entirely possible to mitigate the criminal justice harms associated with marijuana possession without allowing the guy at the corner store to sell it to you. That's possible.
No, we're touching on exactly what I wanted to get to. And this is actually a direct message to my more conservative-minded people in the crowd. The legitimacy of the law is incredibly important. And you need law enforcement and public backing of law enforcement for the laws that you choose to enforce. And they need to be enforced with no quarter. And that's why choosing what is legal and what is illegal is so important. If you do this gray area stuff, you get what you have in Oregon, where the police are completely hamstringed from doing their jobs, and they just let things go. And it's absolutely ridiculous, and it led to an incredible disaster. It's not good to have these very gray area, unclear things. It's like you murder someone, you go to prison forever, and that's how you deal with it. That, you know what I mean? And if you don't want people to be drinking in the streets, you know what you do? You threaten them with jail. And that's why we don't see much drinking happening in the streets. Now, after this event, we'll probably walk out onto that sidewalk, and right in front of the venue have a couple drinks, and that'll probably be allowed to stand. But if we were having a giant party in Central Park, good chance that would be shut down. And that there could be, wait, no?
Yeah, no.
No. Sorry, I'm from Cleveland, and they would do that. They would do that.
19 people's left.
Okay. They did used to do that in Cleveland. But like, if you don't want that to happen, there's clearly ways to enforce it. But you need to threaten real punishment or people don't respond.
Yeah, this
And you should only threaten real punishment for things that you think are worth threatening real punishment for. That's really the crux of this argument. Is it really correct to put a drug crime on someone's record and prevent them from operating like a normal citizen for smoking marijuana? Does your smell of marijuana justify how you're going to be affecting millions of people? Even amid the most illegal marijuana ever was, which was like 1988, there was, how many? Like 40 million marijuana users at that time? How many of them had a criminal record because of their marijuana use? Not in prison. This isn't the people who went to prison, but various people who have been arrested and have something on their record that prevents them from being a normal citizen. It has massive effects.
So, just okay. I want to focus on the first point because I think this is like Friedrich Hayek autism brain. No, actually, you don't have to have all laws either be totally aggressively enforced or not enforced at all. There's lots of spectrum. Here in the American English tradition, we have lots of latitude for discretion enforcement. In fact, you acknowledged that when you said we could like go outside and drink, and nobody would like round us up as they would in Saudi Arabia if we did that. More generally, there are lots of cases where the goal of enforcement is to suppress the extent of the harms of a thing, or in the case of markets, to suppress not the consumption, but rather the production of the good. Here's my favorite example. Prior to 2018, sports betting was formally illegal in most states in the United States. There were like 200 gambling arrests every year. There was also very little at-scale sports betting. You or I could we could make a book. Maybe there's a bookie at the bar. He has 10 guys. There was no at-scale sports betting. Following the NCAA decision, sports betting is rapidly legalized. I think we're up to 30 plus states that have sports betting regimes. You can now bet on sports on your phone. Millions of young men are becoming addicted to sports betting. They will ruin their lives. That's going to happen. We know it happened in the UK. We can look at what's happening in New Jersey already. It's really bad. The goal of prohibition with light enforcement, which is what happened in the sports betting world prior to 2018, was to suppress the infrastructure for big business getting involved in the production of an addictive, harmful good. I am fine with the world. I don't care if you smoke pot. There are pros and cons. I've smoked pot. It's fine. I don't care. What I care about is, can large businesses make a profit off of people consuming things that are bad for them compulsively? I don't need a high level of enforcement. We know what happens when you decriminalize marijuana because a bunch of states did it. 12 states did it in the 70s. You can do a rolling diff and diff. There's a slight increase in marijuana consumption. It's maybe 5 percentage points. It's not enormous. So that's fine with me. I'll take it. What I'm worried about is the structural stuff. And that you can do while having light enforcement.
All right, we're gonna do 2 more questions. Let's see. We'll do you, and then we'll do Ted.
Me?
Yeah.
Alright, so putting aside all the fake news that big anti-smoking has spread about how smoking is bad for you,
It's bad for you.
It's bad for you.
If the cigarette smoking analogy of marijuana being illegal but frowned upon pastime is the best of possible of realistic situations, as you say, why is it not the best possible situation writ large? Why don't we just accept that we try and have a cultural frowning on marijuana because of the smell and the mental impairment, but try and get away with getting rid of some of the legal penalties, whether it be through explicit legalization or just decriminalization, which might serve to continue to suppress the infrastructure, as you say.
I mean, I think so. Armin's question was about political reality. What would I do? And I start from the position of I think I am losing pretty substantially, and I don't have a good playbook for winning, at scale. Because again, I think the bulwark is going to break. I'm not optimistic, and that's how I take that. Why I take that position. What I would say is that there is so 2 things. One is that it could change, right? We did actually have a great backlash against marijuana in the late 1970s and early 1980s. We were close to national decriminalization at the end of the Carter administration. Carter endorsed it. It died in the Senate. We almost got there. 12 states decriminalized. Support for marijuana legalization rose like 15 percentage points in the polls, and then it collapses and it's dead for a generation. It could have happened earlier. There can be great about faces on this issue. It could happen. I'm not optimistic, which is why I'm realistic about what comes next. Here's the other thing. I think it is not inconceivable that within my lifetime cigarettes will be banned. I think that is quite possible. One of the reasons for this is that we have an effective harm-reducing substitute, right? We're not going to get vape. Maybe we'll get vaping for marijuana. I don't know. That would help. But also, like, people hate cigarettes. Other countries are thinking about banning them. We may follow suit eventually. And so that cultural change can breed political change. That may be beneficial. Maybe we'll try marijuana legalization and we'll go, wow, it smells really bad, and also my kids are crazy. I don't like this. And we'll go back. Could happen. Usually it doesn't. We don't undo social changes like that, but I'm a conservative, so I have to hope that there'll be crazy reactions sometimes.
There's this general idea in public health that stigma is necessarily bad, and I think this is sort of a semantics issue, because if stigma is defined as bad judgment, then sure, but what you're trying to get to is actually the ultimate motivator. My favorite writer, who was based in New York City for a bit, and he worked for Andy Warhol, Glenn O'Brien, he said a society with good manners doesn't need laws. And I think that's exactly what we should be thinking about. Why is tobacco use too, but why is cigarette use dropping? Is it really because of these laws, or is it because people are increasingly learning how unhealthy it is for you? When I was a child, I saw my step-grandfather gasping for every single breath before he died of lung cancer. And I have that image burned to my head. And then I saw a black lung in school, and it didn't require a law reducing my access to it. And I was just like, oh, that seems like a bad idea.
Did you go to public school?
I did go to public school.
So you were the subject of a major government-funded propaganda campaign?
That's another discussion.
Okay, so
that would happen.
So policy shapes.
Just because a public institution did it doesn't mean that in a completely private system it wouldn't have happened too. And we're not having the education debate.
No, let's be clear. We should privatize the schools. I'm with you on that.
Yeah. Okay. We're not touching on that. But yeah, morals should be motivated by manners,
which should be supported by the state.
Okay, one more question.
Charles, it seems like there are many other product categories that consumers prefer, that even they love or get addicted to, that cause harm, that big companies profit from. Should we go after sugar and motorcycles and scuba diving and hang gliding and every single thing
Nobody gets
that might kill them? Why stop at cannabis?
In the convention, in the strict sense of the term, people don't get addicted to motorcycles. Motorcycles are not reinforcing. The more you consume motorcycles, you don't you don't consume more motorcycles. There's an upper bound on the motorcycles you consume. So sugars are sort of an interesting topic. I mean, so the actual interesting one is hyper-processed foods. My genuine response to that one is I've not spent enough time in the research literature to have a well-formed opinion on the topic.
Okay.
But here's the point that I would make. My view is, if you can articulate an effective regulatory regime that is harm minimizing, it's probably better to be legal than not. Let me give you a good example. There are small harms associated, caffeine is an addictive, harmful substance. They're very small harms. It's really hard to dose, with coffee and tea, it's really hard to dose enough caffeine to do anything other than give yourself a headache. It's addictive, it's reinforcing. But it's very easy to design a regime where you just if there's a super high potency caffeine product, you don't get to sell it. But also nobody wants that. So it's sort of naturally self-limiting. If I thought that we couldn't do that, as for example I think we can't do with heroin, then I would say it's probably better just to ban it because it's easier. So I would resist in general the claim that stuff people like is addictive. Addictive products are an important subset of commodities that deserve particular attention on the part of regulators and government more generally. And then I would say, look, there are addictive substances that we tolerate legalization of. I'm not horrified by the concept of a legal market in opium. I don't think it's a conversation really worth having because I've already it would be good if we had it, but it wouldn't be the end of the world because opium's it's really hard to dose too much opium. That's an example is, if I can describe regulatory regimes short of prohibition that work. There are many substances for which it doesn't work. There are ways to do it for marijuana. No government has successfully implemented them. Some of them have tried. They're kind of disastrous. I'm willing to move in that direction on the spectrum. I think here in America, our options are pretty much prohibition or retail legalization because we are a capitalistic country. It's why we're the richest, greatest country in human history. It's wonderful. But also probably we shouldn't be allowed to sell pot or other drugs because of that tendency.
Just opium.
Look, I'll go back and forth on opium. It's hypothetical.
All right, I think that was our final one. So I want to give. Oh, I'm so sorry. I know. Were you doing your hair?
Round of applause.
Oh, a round of applause. Yeah, round of applause. That was coming, but later. So I want to kind of do an informal voting. Little derivative, yeah, very informal. But not before we give these guys one chance to, in 2 sentences, I know this is going to be very difficult for you guys, your final statements in favor of legalization and criminalization.
Sorry, just parenthetically, it's driving Jacob as crazy as it's driving me that we didn't take a measure beforehand. So
I know,
nothing to
this
compare
is
to.
Oxford, right? It's America.
Only depending on who would win.
Before we're gonna do this it's gonna be very strange and ADHD the way that we're gonna do this voting process.
You want to go first? You want me to go first?
Yeah, you go ahead and go first. Jacob.
Oh, me?
Like 2 or 3 sentences. You got it.
It's going to be a little longer than that if I go first.
4.
Because I have to defend possible rebuttals. And I
I'm
thought,
not, I won't rebut you.
No, it's fine. No, you should. You absolutely should. And the reason why I'm going to take a little longer is because I thought this is the only thing I actually prepared for. So, think about drunk driving. Is drunk driving dangerous? Is it? Like, you were told that. No. I believe me. I'm going somewhere with this. But how do you know this? Have you looked at the data? There's about 100 million drunk driving incidents every single year. There's about 10,000 deaths from drunk driving incidents, which means the probability of you killing someone if you drink and drive is about 1 in 10,000. So is that dangerous? Maybe one way to think about this is, how long would you have to drink and drive every single night before you, on average, kill one person, including yourself? You would have to drive drunk every single night for over 27 years before you do that.
Wow.
Yeah, you guys should get drunk and drive.
No. But this is how you should think about the marijuana issue. Is drunk driving laws a good idea? They are. Because it's still relatively more dangerous to drink and drive than to not drink and drive. And by having these laws in place and holding people accountable for drinking and driving, the population level health outcomes, you're saving about 10 to 15,000 people a year by enforcing this law. That's the way that you should be thinking about this. What are the outcomes of marijuana legalization versus marijuana criminalization? Traffic accidents, they go up. Homicides, they go down. And various other public health considerations are being debated. But the fact of the matter is, fewer people are being arrested, and by fewer I mean millions. Millions of people have a better quality of life because you are not using the gun of the state to coerce them to do things that they're not willing to change their behavior to do. The most problematic users typically don't change because of laws. That's why they're problematic users. That's all I have to say.
You know, I think it's important to just like divest the conversation of all of the emotional baggage with which it is to mix a metaphor slightly freighted. Imagine that you have come here to Earth from Mars, and somebody tells you about this plant. If you smoke the plant, it feels pretty good. You get sort of drowsy. Maybe you like to eat a lot. It feels pleasant. Sometimes when people smoke the plant, they crash their car, killing themselves and other people. Sometimes when they smoke the plant, they develop schizophrenia or acute psychosis. Sometimes when they smoke this plant, they become compulsively addicted to it. They consume more and more and more until their lives revolve around getting access to this plant. If you came here from Mars and you learned about this plant, and then I asked you, is this something that Walmart should be allowed to sell? Your intuition would be, no, probably not. We can go back and forth about the merits of decriminalization and about the extent of the criminal justice harms. I think they are both substantially overstated. I think the harms are overstated and the solutions to them are relatively reasonable without legalization. The question of legalization, especially in the United States, is ultimately about, should I be allowed to sell that plant that obviously hurts people? My theory is no. I think that that's bad. And I think divested from everything else, that's pretty obvious. Also, don't drink and drive. Is that a Jeff Myron? I've heard that before.
No, it's a Jake Rich original.
Okay.
All right, another round of applause. Just for the hell of it, these guys want to see how successful they were.
There's no baseline.
There's going to be. I'm about to drive. So when you walked in tonight, for those of you willing to admit it, how many of you, just raise your hand, were in favor of marijuana legalization? There they were. All right, put your hand down if you changed your mind. Keep your hand up. Okay. Okay, we're going to do the opposite. If you walked in favor of its criminalization, raise your hand.
I found this system very confusing.
It's not confusing. It's straightforward. If you change your mind, put your hand down.
The audience is confused.
The hands went up. I saw hands go down and then they went up. And I'm like, wait.
Okay, all right. Well,
Those in favor of.
I think it's going to be the same thing. Okay, those in favor of the legalization, raise your hand. Okay, criminalization. All right, I feel like we got a 50-50 split.
It was close.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.